It's so great to be here. Hi, everyone. Hello. I would like to read some excerpts from my book. It's called Dumb, 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 My Mother's Book Reviews. And it's fashioned, I tried to get at my mother's story after she passed away, and so it's fashioned around all the book reviews that she wrote that we didn't know that she was keeping until after she died. And all these book reviews sort of prompted all these memories about who she was and the parts of her I didn't understand, because your parents know you your whole life, but you only know your parents for your lifetime. So it was just it's really an exploration of that. So my mother possessed what she liked to call the Cadillac of tweezers. They were forged in brushed nickel, and the tips were so finely beveled, they were like a surgical instrument for the small bristly hairs that sprung up on her chin. She liked to faux casually name drop the manufacturer like it was a close personal friend. Wusthof. The tweezers were always within arm's reach of her recliner, where she read for hours every day. And she was at an angle for the better part of every day, and she'd be tilted back, a book in her lap, and a pair of whimsically colored reading glasses on a chain around her neck. And then there was the glass of water, magnifying mirror, and a stack of books on the cabinet next to the chair. Most of my adult life, I would stop by my parents' house once a week or so, just to say hi or score a meal or pick up mail that still occasionally got delivered to them, even though I hadn't lived with them for years. And my mother would take a break from her reading, and she'd set the book down on her lap, and we'd talk. She was short, her legs barely reached, her feet barely reached the footrest, and at that slant, I was looking up her nostrils more than in the eyes. And we would talk. We talked about my siblings and the grandchildren. We talked about friends, mine and hers, my love life or lack thereof, my job or lack thereof, movies, television, food, diets, always diets, recipes, always low calorie, and books, always books. Whatever each of us was reading at the time. And she would describe the book that she was currently reading. It would be spread out on her plush lap, all the while running her fingers along her chin in search of goat hairs that might have sprung up. And looking over her reading glasses at me, she'd slap the palm of her hand on the outstretched book and say, "But I swear I've read the damn thing before. Honest to Pete, I can't remember what I've read anymore." A few months after she died, my father and I sorted through 3 large closets gorged with stuff she'd found at Goodwill, garage sales, consignment stores over the years. She loved to shop. There were kitchen gadgets and utensils, books, games, puzzles, crockpots, heating pads, all stashed away for birthdays or Christmas and labeled with the intended recipient's name. We bagged up everything for Goodwill, my father and I, a sort of mercantile circle of life. And my once tall father reached on tiptoes for the clear plastic recipe box on the top shelf, and we clicked open the lid. It was full of index cards with my mother's notes on all the books she'd read the past 15 plus years. She read so many books she had to start keeping track. Brass Verdict, Michael Connelly, can't remember, but kept me interested. Coffin Dancer, Deaver, can't remember. Question mark, forgot name, but was good, Stephen Cannell. The Closers, Michael Connelly, can't remember, but enjoyed it. For such a small box, it was hefty in my hands. "You keep it," my father said as he tied up one of the many trash bags. "You're the writer in the family, after all." The last words I ever spoke to my mother were about cheesecake. My sister had called me, "You need to get home now." So I caught the last flight from Austin, Texas to Minneapolis on a Sunday night, and I got to the hospital close to midnight. My sisters and brothers were crowded into the hospital room, and my father raised his arms like he was going to hug me when I walked into the room. But my mother's hospital bed was between us, and he sat down again as if pulled back by his bewilderment. The sheets and blankets were pulled up smooth under her arms. She hadn't moved in 12 hours to muss the bedding. I leaned over and put my cheek against hers. She'd given me her wedding ring when I got married, and I slipped it back on her finger. And even after a year of chemo and radiation, her cheeks were still cool and velvety. "I ate the cheesecake, Mom." It seemed like her face turned toward me. All I could think was that my breath must be stinky from airline food and the long flight, and she would leave this earth with that last sensory experience. I looked at her so hard my eyeballs started to hurt. My mother never quite knew how beautiful she was, with her high cheekbones, tawny skin, this graceful, streamlined nose, and full lips over front teeth that she was always self-conscious about. As a kid, I used to love to watch her get ready for a rare evening out. After a spritz of Jean Naté and pinning in a wiglet to make her hair poofy, she'd lean into the enormous bathroom mirror to put on lipstick, this deep red lustrous against her olive skin and black hair. She'd rub her teeth with her forefinger to clean off any lipstick that might have smeared on them. "I ate the cheesecake, Mom. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Of everything that went through my mind on the flight to Minnesota, I hadn't once thought about the cheesecake. She'd probably been waiting her whole life to win that argument. The bone setter's daughter, Tan, Amy, 8 out of 10, almost as good as her other books, another mother-daughter relationship, but loved the way she writes. It was the night before Thanksgiving, and my mother had already made potatoes and stuffing for the next day. And the cheesecake she made once a year. The recipe was actually a Jell-O box mix, but she added cream cheese and extra butter and extra sugar. My family does not understand what people mean when they say a particular food is too rich. I'd come home from college for the weekend, and after everyone had gone to bed, I sneaked into the kitchen like a cat burglar. I knew every creak in the stairs, every squeak in the hardwood floor, and down the hallway, and the point at which the suction of the fridge would pop open when you pulled the door. I painstakingly peeled back the foil on the pan. In the middle of the night, on a secret mission, foil reaches approximately 150 decibels. It was just going to be a nibble, and then suddenly this entire thin row at the front was missing. It was crooked, so I ate even more to even it out, as if that would help camouflage that I'd eaten it in the first place. My mother discovered it first thing in the morning and was furious and immediately blamed me. In spite of 5 kids, 2 in-laws, my father, and a dog in the house, she assumed I had eaten it. I was outraged and declared my innocence. At the very least, I deserved the decency of being a possible suspect. At least put me in a lineup. My mother never let it drop, and it came up over and over and over again in the 30-plus years since. And she would shoehorn it into some completely unrelated conversation. I got mad every single time. I denied it every single time. My mother was unperturbed, shrugged a shoulder, and continued on with the conversation with maybe just a little twitch of gotcha on her lips. I can see, I can hear the precise way my mother used to describe something as dumb. The way she said it, it was a curt summation that sounded almost onomatopoetic. Her chin retracted slightly as the hard D came out, and then her mouth went slack with the drawn-out M at the end. At the same time, she'd give her head a little shake, and her eyes narrowed a bit as the MB hung in the air like an underline. And if some of the dumb books were really dumb, she didn't even bother with a rating. Dark Dreaming Dexter, Lindsay, Jeff, dumb. Wood, Stewart, Dark Harbor, dumb, dumb, dumb. Read no more by this author. There were a lot of books before my mother started her record keeping. I can still see the covers of Dr. Zhivago, Gone with the Wind, Lonesome Dove, The Shipping News, The Onion Field, Bonfire of the Vanities, The Thornbirds, and Fat is a Feminist Issue. I did not like that book, even though I'd never read it. And I took the long way around it, wherever it might be in the house. I never picked it up to read the back cover like I did with all her other books. I was afraid I'd be identified as being fat by association if people should see me in too close proximity to the book. I'd been born pudgy and stayed pudgy, and I didn't want anyone to know. And then my mother read The Woman's Room. It was the late 1970s, the height of the women's movement, and all my mother's friends had read it. Marilyn French's feminist novel tells the story of some women who married in the 1950s to the domestic bliss promised them, only for their husbands to leave them for younger women and leave them stranded. And day after day, the hefty hardcover rested on her lap as she sat in her reading chair. My mother was pressed against the brown plaid upholstery of the colonial-style armchair, jaw set, breathing through flared nostrils as she turned the pages. She seemed mad a lot after that book. And in her book reviews, I can practically hear her irritation about certain books. Be Mine, Kosicki, Laura. Boring. I read 55 pages, thrilling but nothing thriller but nothing thrilling. Get Back Boogie, James Lee Burke, read about half, a real waste of time. And then one of my very favorite reviews of hers. Circe, David, Last Things. Page 4. Use the word eschatological made me so angry at the author I quit the book. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to bring up our first storyteller. I don't want to speak for Kevin, but we just had such a great time with these storytellers, and it was just so powerful and such a delight the way they were willing to open up and really dig deep in their stories. So it is my pleasure to bring up Brian Matuszak, who has been part of the Twin Ports theater scene for nearly 40 years. He has worn many hats, including writer, performer, director, and producer. And tonight he is excited to try on the fancy chapeau of storyteller. Brian Matuszak.
Thank you. All right. Before I get started, I just really want to say thank you to Ashley and WDSC for this amazing opportunity to practice an art form that I was interested in but had never dived into, so I got a chance to do it, and I got a chance to do it with Kevin Kling and Mary Jo Pehl, so that was amazing, so thank you. All right. The safest place I have ever found myself was not snuggled up against my brother in the back seat of my parents' car on the way home from a snowy Christmas Eve spent at my grandparents' house. And it was not hermetically sealed inside a warm cocoon of blankets and cats during a particularly nasty cold and flu season. The safest place that I've ever found myself was on stage with the Duluth comedy troupe Colder by the Lake in the El Paso sketch. A few people have probably seen it. You may wonder why that's my safe place. I mean, one of the defining characteristics of live theater is that it's live. You're in front of actual living human beings, just like now. Anything could happen. Sounds like kind of the opposite of safe. But it wasn't for me, eventually. I mean, at first I was scared to death. First time I took the stage to perform El Paso, as soon as the lights came up, the sweat started pouring off of me and came off of me and kept pouring off of me. When I joined Calder back in 1987, I didn't know much about the art of live theater at all. I knew it was something I wanted to do, but growing up out in the farm country of Saginaw, Minnesota, other than pretending to enjoy manual labor, there weren't a lot of opportunities to act. But that's why El Paso is a brilliant sketch. It's a classic. It's like Who's on First or More Cowbell. It's always going to get laughs, 100% guaranteed. And the laughs would come at the same place every time we did it, like comedy clockwork. You could set your squirting wristwatch by it. And that safety net of laughter gave me the confidence that I needed to carry me through to all aspects of performance. I started to pay attention to why the laughs were coming when they did. What were the performers doing that helped enhance the silliness of that sketch? You know, a grimace or a mug with the face or a gesture or an exaggerated movement. I watched and I learned how to control an audience and make them laugh whenever I wanted to. It was like an evil superpower. Another aspect of its brilliance as a comedy sketch was that there were no lines. There was nothing you had to memorize. The way it worked was you would play the classic Marty Robbins tune, El Paso, and then 5 actors just act out the entire song on stage. That's it. And it was always a hit. It killed. Over the years, I played many different parts. I was a tied-up horse. I was a shiny bullet. I was a part of the rotating desert landscape. See, one actor, the way it worked, one actor would have a stick horse and would stand in place at the front of the stage and then just gallop in place while the rest of us hurried up and we grabbed some cards and they had a desert scene on it. One card had a rock, a couple cards had sand, and one had a cactus, and we would move behind the rider like this here. So when you got to the end, see, it looked like he was riding, and then when you got to the end, you broke off and came back around. The cactus was the prime role in this part of the sketch. But it was pretty much just the luck of the draw if you got the cactus, because we moved so fast from scene to scene within the sketch that when that part of the song came up, you had 4 sweaty actors who were scrambling and grabbing cards and hurrying up to line up behind the lead of the sketch, that guy on the stick horse, that riding cowboy. That was the part I always wanted, but I never got. The narrator of the song, the person who walked into Rosa's cantina in that fateful night and spied Felina. That part had everything. Physical comedy, a chance to be big and silly and goofy, and have every single person in the audience love you. Which is why I never got it. It went to Andy Nelson. Every time. Andy, seriously though, Andy deserved it. Andy had that it factor, charisma, very cool, very funny. People just were naturally drawn to watching Andy. So, of course it went to him. And he was a fantastic human being. R.I.P. But I was just destined to be the horse / bullet / cactus, and that was okay. To this day, after doing live theater for nearly 40 years, most of it in comedy, El Paso remains the single biggest guaranteed laugh getter I've ever performed in. I've done shows by Neil Simon, David Mamet, Shakespeare, amateurs, compared to the El Paso comedy sketch. By providing a beginner like me with that safety net, I gained the confidence and the craving to keep doing live theater. I heard that laughter and that applause, and I was hooked. But the most energizing laughter of all came from my parents. My mom and dad came to every show I did, which, to be honest, kind of surprised me. Growing up in the tiny town of northern Minnesota, parental acceptance and encouragement was usually for the extracurricular activities like sports. There weren't any artistic activities in our high school, other than some silly slapped-together plays put on by the English teacher with snappy names like Aaron Slick from Pumpkin Crick. Football was the main Friday night draw in Saginaw, which worked well for my starting quarterback brothers, but not so much for so far down the bench he's in the next zip code, me. But my folks were there to support all of us, no matter what we did. They cheered for touchdown passes just as loudly as they laughed at the sight of me in 10 layers of stage makeup kissing a pumpkin. That support followed me out of high school into college. Fall of 1981, and I am now a theater major at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. At this point, I still don't know anything about theater other than a bored English teacher who just sat in the back of the gymnasium and said, "We can't hear you," which actually, truth be told, is a really good piece of stage direction. But I just knew that there was something there for me. It felt pretty cool to be in front of a group of people and have everybody looking at you and laughing at you, especially Mom and Dad. My dad had a great laugh. I loved listening to that bounce off the walls of the darkened theater where I was doing what can only be loosely defined as acting. Even though I couldn't see him, I could picture him with a crooked smile breaking up his big face, beaming with pride. A pride that, again, usually emanated from the faces of fathers at sporting events. The best feature of Dad's laughter, by the way, was that it was genuine. That catch of breath at the beginning. It possessed a quality of surprise that suggested he hadn't anticipated any of my silliness. It was honest. And more importantly, it felt earned. He didn't dole it out like a participation trophy. If it wasn't funny, he wasn't laughing. Unfortunately, I only had one opportunity to hear that laughter while I was at UMD. I was only in one play, a student-directed one-act play by Edward Albee called The American Dream. I got to play a timid, unassertive man who didn't have a clue what was happening all around him. That perfectly encapsulated my time at UMD. That's not to say anything bad about the UMD theater program, by the way. It's a top-notch program with fantastic instructors. It's a great, wonderful educational opportunity for students who aren't me. It might be different today, but back in 1981, freshmen weren't allowed to sniff the stage. A first-year student back then, you had to sit in classroom after classroom listening to instructor after instructor breathlessly expound on every magnificent aspect of live theater. You were expected to audition for every show, but you were not allowed to be in any show. You were never going to be cast. Instead, you just came and watched the shows while the sophomores and the juniors and the seniors brought them to life. And that didn't work for me. Nothing about being that far removed from creating the art clicked for me. So after a year, I dropped out. Well, truth be told, I actually did enroll and start my second year, but then I found out that the fall musical that I was going to have to audition for was Grease. So then I quit. So I'm 19 years old, I'm living at home, I'm a college dropout with no idea what to do with the rest of my life. It's every parent's dream. Luckily, the support, though, didn't stop. My mom and dad were so patient with me. It was like that they knew something was going to click for me. It might be theater, it might be something else, but they gave me the space and the trust that I would figure it out. It took a couple years. Summer 1984, I auditioned and I was finally cast in a show here in Duluth. It was a small part in the Duluth Playhouse production of Neil Simon's Fools. I got to play something Snetsky. That's not me forgetting the character's name. That was the character's name. It was a tiny part, but it was big and loud and goofy. It was perfect for me. The lead was a young man named Jim Gallagher. And one day Jim mentioned, while we were sitting around at rehearsal, that he was a theater major over across the bridge at UW-West, University of Wisconsin-Superior. I told him my story about UMD, how I couldn't really find my way into theater, so he suggested that I cross that bridge and check out their program. Invited me, in fact, to come and watch a rehearsal of the play that they were working on at the same time. He was in 2 shows. So I said, sure. What's the show? It was Grease. But I did. I went over there and checked it out, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is where something finally did click. UWS had everything for me. I met my mentor, the director of Grease, Professor John D. Mansell, a tall, lanky, chain-smoking theatrical genius. One day I was in his beginning acting class, and after I had brought my 50th horrible monologue and performed it, then we would sit back down and he would critique your performance. So the day I did this, I sat down and he sat silently or felt like 10 minutes. He was puffing on his cigarette. Remember, this is the 80s, so you could be in a classroom with a cigarette. And then he slowly turned to me, and he said, "You act like you have a stick up your Okay. We need to get a few beers in you and figure out who in the hell you are." Okay, let's do that. So class was dismissed and we all went to the beer bar on campus. Yay, Wisconsin! But it was valuable because I did learn that not only were pitchers of beer only $2, but also that you had to start with what's inside of you. Your experiences, your beliefs, your wants and your desires, and that is a starting point to find your way into a performance and to start creating theater. John also taught me that even though it's a lot of work, it should be fun. There's a reason that they call it a play, he used to say. UWS Theater is also where I met my wife, Sue, and actually on Monday, we will be celebrating our 35th wedding anniversary. Thank you. No, thank you. So a lot of good things in my life can be traced back to crossing that bridge and going to UWS. The other aspect of UWS that was advantageous to a theater beginner was that they put you on the stage immediately. They had main stage seasons, experimental stage seasons, student-directed shows, acting scenes for the TV studio, acting classes, for every style of acting imaginable. I was in heaven. Every production was giving me a chance to be in front of an audience. Every opportunity, I'm gaining more and more confidence in what I'm doing. Then I get involved in Colder by the Lake and experiencing that sheer joy of El Paso while secretly hoping that Andy Nelson would trip and break his face. I'm kidding. And then I'm writing the sketches. Pretty soon I'm confident enough to do that. And then they're letting me direct my own shows. And then in 1991, the power goes to my head and I eventually start my own theater company, Renegade Comedy Theater, where we write and perform not only sketch comedy, but scripted comedies. We get to pick the scripts that we want to do, and it's fantastic. And it's clicking along. And then in 2001, I'm hired by UWS to teach and to direct. And it's like my dream job, and I'm circled back to the place where I found my way into this amazing art form of theater. And through that all, the parental support that I received never wavered. And I'm hearing Dad's laughter echoing off lots and lots of different darkened theater halls, and I'm feeling fulfilled, everything's clicking, and I'm safe, and it's great. Until 2008. You know that one day that you have where you wake up, and the second you wake up, the rest of the day is just nothing but dark, dank sewage stink? For me, that day was a year, and it was the year 2008. There was not a lot of clicking to be found that year. There was no safety. In February, I was ousted from the theater company that I had founded, and which I invested 17 years of blood, sweat, and dollar bills into. And that's all I have to say about that. Well, one more thing. It hurt. A lot. My love for theater took a hit. A few months later, my dream job of teaching and directing theater at the place where it had all come together for me was eliminated due to budget cuts, so that's a bigger hit. But then the biggest smack around of all came. Dad's health was starting to decline. Specifically, his liver cancer had returned and spread to his lungs. That booming laughter was fading farther and farther into the distance. This was all challenging, but I wasn't ready to give up on theater just yet. Perhaps, as it had done all my life, it could help get me through some of these awful times. My wife and I had started up a new theater company earlier in the year, Rubber Chicken Theater. Get it? Rubber Chicken. We bounce back. Yeah, well, we like the name. Yeah. So our first couple shows went well, and we decided we were going to close out that year with a traditional holiday sketch comedy review, just like we had done with Colder and just like Renegade had used to do. So there was a built-in audience of people always enjoying and coming to see that show. So maybe, just maybe, at the very last minute, I could turn this crappy year around. No. Once the review opened, the bottom pretty much fell out. Artistically and comedically, the show was strong, but audiences just weren't making the trek to come and see it in the only venue that I could find on the outskirts of town. Then right before Christmas, my mom sends out an email to the family that starts like this. This is the hardest email I have ever had to send. Then, being my mom, she also apologized for the fact that it was a mass email, like we were going to hold that against her, that she didn't personally contact each and every one of us in the family to tell us that Dad had to be moved into hospice. And that is when I experienced the absolute worst week, not only of 2008, but of my entire life. We sat in that sterile hospital room day after day, listening to my dad's struggling gasps and watching his crooked, wonderful smile dissolve into a thin, lifeless line. There was no joy in that. At the end of the week, it came time for me to leave for the closing performance of our show, for the review, and I did not want to go. It felt like I was abandoning my family. My brother was experiencing the same thing. He was a coach of a high school team that was in a holiday tournament that night, and he didn't want to leave either. But Mom told us that it was fine to leave for a few hours because Dad would want us to go. He loves watching you boys do what makes you happy. So there's that support again. I went in to let Dad know that I would be back after the show, and then I headed out. And all night, whenever I got off stage, I would check my phone, fearing the worst. After the big musical pie, shaving cream pie in the face number, because remember, this is not Henry V, it's a sketch comedy review, I washed off the shaving cream and I rushed back to the hospital. My sister-in-law was sitting with Dad, and I could tell by her face that it wouldn't be long. So I stepped up to the bedside and I whispered, "I'm back, Dad." And then I went into the family room. My brother was back from the game, and we chatted about how surreal our nights had been, how our bodies were, in the theater or in the basketball court, but our minds were tethered back here at the hospital. After a few minutes, my sister-in-law came in, and it was time. Mom rushed ahead, and as the rest of us entered, we found her in the position that she'd been in all week, next to Dad with her two hands clamped around his wrist as if she could keep him here through sheer will. We gathered in a tight circle around my parents, listening as the gap between Dad's labored, rattling breaths became longer and longer, and then stopped. We paused, desperately listening for just one more breath, but it never came. Immediately, the silence was filled with choked-off sobs and whispered declarations of love, and then it was over. So a few minutes later, we're back in the family room packing up our stuff, and my other brother said something which I honestly only half heard at the time. "He waited for you to get back, Bri." I nodded, finished shoving my stuff into an overnight bag, and I headed out. Nothing seemed real. I was in this fog of grief, and I just felt nothing. Empty. In the car on the way home, I was forming a goodbye to the cast and the crew of the show, figuring out how I was going to tell them it was for the best that Rubber Chicken just went away for a while. And that's when it clicked. He waited. My dad waited for me. He waited until I got back from doing that show. That night, my father decided to spend his last few hours on this earth waiting for his son to be loud and silly and get hit in the face with a shaving cream pie. My dad, who only had a couple hours left of life, chose to spend them waiting for me to land in that safety net again. If I walked away from theater now just because of a dreadful, awful suckfest of a year, I would be disrespecting his last few hours. And I would also be disrespecting his laughter. A laughter that I had spent a lifetime earning and that had completely blanketed me in safety and love. So for the last 14 years since that night, I kept on acting, writing, directing, and producing live theater right here in the Northland. I did it for him. I did it for me. But mostly, I did it for a chance to finally play the lead in that damn El Paso sketch. Thank you.
Brian Matuszak. Thank you, Brian. Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I am thrilled to introduce Galen Lee. She won NPR Music's Tiny Desk contest in 2016. And since then, she has captivated audiences around the world with her haunting original songs and traditional fiddle tunes. Galen has opened for Wilco, the Decemberists, Low, and the industrial rock supergroup Pigface. Most recently, she composed music for Macbeth on Broadway, starring Daniel Craig and Ruth Negga. She is a sought-after public speaker about disability rights and accessibility in the arts. And she has shared her perspective on PBS NewsHour, On Being with Krista Tippett, the Moth Radio Hour, Now This, the Science of Happiness podcast, and 2 widely viewed TEDx talks. And she is currently working on a memoir about her touring adventures and disability advocacy. Please welcome Galen Lee.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the wonderful storytellers. I can't wait to hear the last 2. And I'm going to perform some instrumental music for you tonight. This first tune is an Irish fiddle tune called Boys of Blue Hill. But I got to play it in Ireland way back in 2016 for my first tour overseas, where I accidentally introduced it as an English fiddle tune. And the audience was like, whoa. So don't do that. Make sure you know where they come from. So this is Boys of Blue Hill. Thank you. Thank you. When I first started performing solo, I began to use the looping pedal, which is how I'm building up those layers live. So it can either be really cool or go terribly wrong, depending on when you push the button. So the next song I'm going to do is a traditional Irish fiddle tune called Swallowtail Jig. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now on with the show.
Galen Lee. Oof. Well, if you know nothing else about our next storyteller, know this. He has a one-man band that writes songs exclusively about Scooby-Doo. For 23 years, Luke Moravec has called Duluth his home. In this community, he has found support for his endeavors regardless of the level of zaniness. He created the game Professor Prank, which was ranked internationally as the 14th best virtual escape room of 2021. And he once ran up a streak of having jumped in Lake Superior at least once every month for 12 and a half years. Please welcome Luke Moravec.
Hey, I've spent my life attempting to create a correct path through good choices. My youth was spent absorbing and formulating a moral code of conduct. I think this made me a really good candidate for the DARE program in elementary school. For those that don't know, DARE was an acronym, and it stood for something. That part didn't stick, but the motto did. It was DARE, to keep kids off drugs. And for me, it worked. Never done drugs. And back in the day, it definitely kept me from talking to the taller fifth graders and anybody who could grow a mustache. So yeah, my life has been filled with wholesome, good kid choices. Now, despite that, I still have managed to make some decisions that have been not quite right. Freshman year of high school, I'm at a hockey game, in the stands, in the pep band, playing my tuba. And I'm sitting next to my buddy, this guy, I should say, Vinny Arnoldi. He's this cool kid in the band who could be cool and be in the band and somehow pull off that balance. And he was next to me, he's kind of giving me the business, kind of like antagonistically punching me in the shoulder. It didn't hurt or anything, but I responded to this by saying, "You can't hurt me. I'm made of cheese." I don't know why I said it. There was no context for it. Anybody who was able to hear over the din of the stick slapping at the puck, they turned and they looked at me. Saying that you're made of cheese, it's not necessarily a wrong thing to say, but it certainly wasn't quite right. Now, 3 years later, I'm hanging out with like 7 or 8 guys who were also in the concert band. We're at Ben Walker's house. It was one of those winter nights, Friday night in the winter time, and it was late enough in the season for the novelty of snow to have kind of worn off, one of those evenings where everybody's in for the night by 6 p.m. Ben and his family, they lived on Highland Parkway in St. Paul, and it was a nice place, nothing too flashy, but it was, put together and presentable, one of those places. Well, for whatever reason that night, the 7 or 8 of us decided that we were going to go down to Ben's basement. I'd never been before, not sure why we went, but as put together and presentable as the upstairs of the house was, the basement was just like any other basement I'd ever seen in St. Paul. It was dated, there were wood paneling along the wall. It was just basically clutter. There was a desk piled with stuff, there's a file cabinet, old furniture, just a whole bunch of stuff that was really one step away from ending up in the garbage. Now, on the far end of this cluttered basement, there's a door. And through that door is an empty, square room. There's nothing in there. There's no furniture, there's no shelves on the wall, no paintings hanging, no windows, no window wells, just nothing. I mean, it seemed like the kind of room that a teenager would call dibs on, Or maybe there'd be a ham radio down there, or a make-your-own fly fishing lures station, a foosball table, anything, but there's nothing. Not even a hot water heater or an electrical box, just nothing. Well, it wasn't completely empty. All over the floor, there were condensed cardboard boxes, like moving boxes. It was the only thing in the room, just these boxes, maybe 3 to 4 dozen flat, dry, brown rectangles. That's the only thing in the room. Now, we learned a couple things about this room pretty quick. One is if you closed the door behind you, it would cut off any residual light from the main part of the basement. Also, if you then turned out the lights, you were in the complete dark. I think it was Pete Vogel who turned off the lights and closed the door. He was a first-chair trumpet player and kind of a goofball. Anyways, there we are in the dark. And somebody picks up a cardboard box, hauls off, and just starts hitting people with it. I think that was Will Swisher. I can't be sure. I think it was Will Swisher. He used to be a trumpet player but got moved over to the French horn section. I think it's easier to hide a bad French horn player in the band than it is to hide a bad trumpet player. Anyway, before we knew it, we all had cardboard boxes, and we are just hitting each other with them. And we'd never said a word. We didn't agree to this. It just sort of happened. And there were no alliances. There were no sworn enemies. There were certainly no rules. This is just, we somehow silently agreed that this is how we were going to spend our Friday night. And we were at this for a while, and then after a while, the rules suddenly changed because somebody introduced a glow-in-the-dark Super Ball. Suddenly, this glowing orb is bouncing around the room. And again, the rules, they changed, again, unspoken. It became very clear that if you were brave enough or perhaps foolish enough, you could go and try to obtain the ball and hold on to it, knowing full well that as the ball was the only thing in the room that we could see, you were going to be the target for everyone with their cardboard boxes. Now, not everybody went after the ball, but I have to admit I did. I liked it. I would cast my cardboard box aside, and I would run over, grab the ball, and I would just wait to be pinballed back and forth by the cardboard boxes before eventually, of course, inevitably hitting the ground where the assault continued from overhead. And a lot of the boxes at this point in the evening had become kind of limp and almost like whip-like. It was... I know it's weird to say, but there was a strange kind of comfort to being on the ground and still holding on to the glowing Super Ball. It was almost like aggressively being tucked into bed. Eventually, just out of sportsmanship, I would cast the ball away and play would continue. Now, it wasn't a wrong way to spend a Friday night, but it wasn't quite right. But unlike when I said I was made of cheese, at least we were being not quite right together. Now, fast forward a decade. I'm living in Duluth. I am gainfully employed. I am a homeowner living by myself, and it's another weekend in the wintertime. It's midnight, and my phone rings. I pick it up, and it's my buddy John. He sounds really excited and probably a little bit drunk. He says, "Hey, there's this episode of Nova hosted by E." Now, E is Mark Oliver Everett. He's the main musician in The Eels. It's one of mine and John's favorite bands. He also happens to be the son of the Dr. Hugh Everett, one of the pioneers in the many worlds theory, this complex notion that our timeline will fracture and multiply. Anyways, John says, "I got the episode loaded up on my computer. I'm coming over." Quick reminder, it's wintertime, it's midnight. I'm in Duluth, and by the way, John is living in St. Paul. So I say, "Okay, yeah, John, sure. See you soon." Laugh, hang up, I go to bed. And of course, 3 hours later, I wake up because there is somebody on my front porch, and yes, it is John, maybe still a little bit drunk. I honestly thought for a moment that he was there to kill me. It went through my head. But he's got his computer in hand, and we fire up that episode of Nova. Now, I can't generally say that I recommend watching TV at 3 in the morning, but what I can say is this. Every day of my life, I have spent one of those 24 hours between the hours of 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. We all do it every single day. We spend one of those hours of our day between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. And on that day, I learned more between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. than I have ever learned before in my life. In the episode, we followed E as he learned more about the father that he never really knew. It was very, very sweet. But the science takeaway from the episode for me was that the choices that we make, each choice that we make, creates a new and parallel dimension, a new and parallel timeline, a universe. This is mathematics. This is based on quantum physics. And maybe talking about science puts you to sleep, but it did not put me to sleep. It kept me awake. And this episode finished at 4 in the morning. Sometimes it still keeps me awake because here's the thing. In some other reality that's really happening, John didn't drive up to Duluth, and I didn't watch that episode of Nova. And if any of you are thinking at this point that this is sounding like pseudoscience and not real science, consider this. Some 5-6 decades ago, when Dr. Hugh Everett first presented this to colleagues, he was largely dismissed. But now, there are many in the field who regard this theory as highly as the theory of relativity and the theory of gravity. We're talking Einstein and Newton. Smart people. And you can trust me because I'm a smart person who once spent a Friday night hitting his friends with a cardboard box, but that's neither here nor there. I'd actually like to take a moment and get back to Vinnie Arnoldi. You might remember he was the guy who was I told him I was made of cheese, that guy. Anyways, over the course of high school, Vinnie and I were never like super close buddies or anything like that, but we were nice to each other, we talked, and we were both in band for all 4 years, so that's saying something. And one day we just kind of casually passed in the hallway at school, senior year, and he asks me, "How's it going?" And I said, "Great. This morning I ate my breakfast cereal using my favorite spoon." Vinnie Arnoldi had every right to say, "I'm Vinnie Arnoldi, I'm super cool, and I'm in the band. Not even Fonzie could pull that off, and you think I want to hear about your favorite spoon?" And maybe in some other universe he did say that. Maybe in some other reality he said that, but that's not what I heard in this one. Instead, I heard Vinnie say, "Really? Tell me about your favorite spoon." So I did. I said, it's all metal. It's got a flat handle with these little factory-carved fleur-de-lis in these squares going down the stem. I like the way the carvings feel in my hand. And then Vinnie said, "Nice. My favorite spoon is..." And he started to tell me about his favorite spoon. Vinnie Arnoldi had a favorite spoon. It is so easy to feel alone. It's so easy to feel like your group of friends is the not quite right group. It's so easy to feel like having a favorite spoon is like yours and yours alone. Vinnie Arnoldi having a favorite spoon, for me, that was the clincher. This is the not quite right timeline. All right, all those other timelines, they might have an easier go of things, but we are not on those timelines. We are on this one, this timeline that I have helped create with my not quite right choices. This timeline that you have helped create with your not quite right choices. You see, Dr. Hugh Everett and other high-level quantum physicists, they'll tell you that there are countless other universes out there, and there are countless other us's out there. But this is the universe in which I had a really weird cardboard box battle. This is the universe in which I said I was made of cheese. This is the universe. This is the timeline. This is the reality in which you know what you did. You know all of your contributions. See, even the best of us have a history that is rich with not quite right choices. Not even Vinnie Arnoldi could run from it. And don't run from it, because this collectively created timeline, this is our community. Your truest community, believe it or not, whether you want to believe it or not, is not your neighborhood block. It is not your city or your country. It's not even your planet. Your purest community is this timeline, this not quite right timeline. So, I am done sweating my not quite right choices, because at least I know that I am making them in the comfort of a community, of a home that we have created together. Thank you.
Luke Moravec. Thank you, Luke. I'm so happy to bring up my pal, Kevin Kling. Kevin is from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he lives on purpose. When you freeze paradise, it lasts a little longer. Close quote. He has performed his stories in libraries, school gymnasiums, the Kennedy Center, off-Broadway, regional theaters, and storytelling festivals around the U.S., including the National Festival in Jonesboro. His international tours include Australia, Europe, and Thailand. He has been a commentator for National Public Radio's All Things Considered and was featured in the Emmy-winning PBS documentary Kevin Kling, Lost and Found. Kevin works with Interact Theater, a company of performers with and without disabilities, exploring how, through our stories, we are connected. Kevin Kling.
Hi, everybody. Oh, now I know I'm in Minnesota. Hi, everybody. Hi. Oh, there. All right, thanks. So yeah, now you get an idea of the kind of experience we had with this workshop. I mean, how about another hand for our two storytellers and Mary Jo and Galen. Oh man. Yeah, it was a dream. It absolutely was a dream. And so our themes were family, faith, and community. Those were the things that we really focused on. So tonight I wanted to go into a little bit of, well, community to start off with Minnesota. Because when I travel, I tell people what it's like to grow up here and live here. And I remember one thing recently I read was that we use Siri less than any other state in the Union. And I read a comment after that said, "'Cause we don't want to bother her." One time I was traveling and I was going down the Mississippi River and I got to St. Cloud and I was staying across the street from this church and they had a sign in the window that said, hot dish contest. We have hot dish here. And I was like, oh God, I got to go to that. So I went to the hot dish contest, and since I was the only person that didn't bring a hot dish, I was the judge. And so they made me the judge, and I'm going through, and you know who's going to win. Tater tot hot dish. That was going to be, and I came to it, so I knew, okay, there's my winner. And I kept going, and I got to one that they called steak hot dish. I went, wrong. You can't have steak hot dish. But then they had the recipe next to it, and they had an asterisk by the word steak. So I go down to the bottom, and by the asterisk, it said, steak may be replaced with wieners. Winner. So that one won. When I travel, I also tell people about ice fishing, that we actually do ice fish here. And I tell them about it. There's a house that's about the size of this stage with holes in the corner where you fish. And about a buddy of mine who one time, he was fishing, and all of a sudden, bam, something hit, something bigger than he'd ever had in his life. And he finally reeled it in. And it was a license plate. And he threw it in the corner. And he goes, looks at it, and runs outside to see the hole in the ice where his truck used to be. So I tell people about growing up in Minnesota. I tell them about, let's see, where are we here? Oh. Wait, I don't have better eyes than I thought. Can you get quadruple? I got trifocals, but, okay. So a while ago, I'm in Ireland. I'm in Ireland with my mom. And I'm in Ireland with my mom because she called me up one day and she said, I heard it's hard to travel when you're 80. I'm 79, we're going to Ireland. So we went to Ireland, and we were having the greatest time. And I tell people now, I say, whatever you do, especially after COVID, don't put it off. Please, go to Ireland with my mom. We had the funnest time. And I'm in this boat, and I'm trying to get up a ladder, and I'm having a really hard time. And you can probably tell why. Because my two arms are different than each other, and they're probably different than yours. At my left arm, I've got 4 fingers, no thumb on this side. I've got this brace that I've worn since I was 3 years old. It's great, especially if you've got a brother, Perry Thrust. And so this is my left arm, and my right arm, I was in a motorcycle accident 20 years ago, and I lost the use of my right arm. And so I tell people, especially kids right away, when I'm working with kids, I tell them about my arms because I know they're going to wonder about my arms. So I tell them about it, and I tell adults too, because I know adults are out there. I wonder if he knows about his arms. And so I'm trying to climb up this ladder, and I'm having a really hard time. And this boat captain finally turns to me. This guy hasn't said anything all week. And he turns to me and he says, every man goes out of his mind in his own way. Yeah. And everybody goes into their mind in their own way. Because a couple of days later, I'm sitting in a pub with a guy from Germany. And I'm telling him I'm a storyteller. And he goes, you're a storyteller? And I go, yeah. And he goes, there are jobs for that? And I go, yeah. And he goes, do you get paid? And I go, sometimes I do. And he goes, and do you just make them up? And sometimes I do. And he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe there's a job for a storyteller. So I go, okay, if you could tell a story, what would you tell? Oh, he says, I'd never tell a story. I go, okay, look, if you could write something, if you could write anything, what would you write? Oh, and he gets a dreamy look on his face and he goes, a manual. Oh, to write something and have someone do it. So this is when I learned there are story people and there are manual people. And so this is for the story people among us. Okay, go look here. The stories. Stories connect us. The Greeks thought of stories like a loom, in that vertically runs the metaphor, horizontally runs the sequence, and where they come together, they wove their invisible threads for their cloaks of immortality. A story, when I can tell a story about something, it doesn't control me any longer. There's this great phrase from Zimbabwe, until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero. And it's really true. When we can tell a story about something, it becomes our own. It's in our vernacular. It's how we see the world. And we can tell a story about our community. It's how we hold ourselves together. One of my favorite words is resiliency. Resiliency actually defined means maintaining one's shape. And how do we maintain our shape when it's been compromised? We do it through family, faith, community. They hold us together until we grow into our new selves. Resiliency. My friend Al Baker, who's a medicine man on Le Coudray, he says, you can make it through anything with sense of humor and sense of self. Sense of self. Okay, I'm in New York City, and I'm going to tell stories for the first time in New York. I'm so excited. And I'm sitting there and I'm having breakfast. I got my eggs and potatoes and toast and coffee, and the waitress walks by. And I ask her if I can get some water. And she goes, it's in the coffee. Okay, this isn't Minnesota. And I think, I got to think, what am I going to do tonight? Because I was thinking, more happens on the subway than has happened in my whole life. So I'm thinking, okay, I got to come up with something. So here's what I told these guys in New York City, because I figure we all have the same parental thing. I mean, the things that we've heard tonight about fathers. I think of my father. And I think when I look in the mirror, I want to see him looking back at me, but I don't look at my dad like my dad. But sometimes I hear these phrases spring from my lips, phrases that don't make any sense to me. Like, it's colder than old Billy Ned, he used to say. What? Or he'd say, it's hotter than a $3 pistol. Or one time he said, Kevin, you're about as funny as a hole in the fence. Like, what? And some of these come from his farming background, like, you're so educated, you're stupid. Or when I couldn't get my go-kart to work, he said, the loose nut is usually the one on the seat. I go, Dad, it worked fine yesterday. That's what the farmer said about his dead mule. Our neighbor, the Sloans, he used to mix and match his sayings, like, it ain't rocket surgery for crying outside. I remember one time my dad's phrases were put to the test. We're in the car, and my sister and her friend are in the front seat. My brother and I are in the back seat, and we're going to swimming lessons. And my dad said something was tight. I think it was a jar lid. And he goes, yeah, that jar lid was tighter than... And then he stopped. We'd heard many of his tighter than analogies, so we knew none of them were appropriate for this present company. And so finally he goes, tighter than the bark on a tree. Oh, God, we laughed our heads off. We had to compliment him for his cobbled say no. And then sometimes I wonder if I'm even getting his phrases right. Like my neighbor, Misha, he has a 9-year-old son. And he was telling his son the other day, a 3-legged dog walks into the bar and says, I'm looking for the man who shot my paw. Well, the next day he overhears his son telling his little friend the joke. A 3-legged dog walks into the bar and says, I'm looking for the man who shot my dad. And both boys are laughing their heads off. So sometimes, like a couple of summers ago, I'm helping my brother. We're getting a dock out of the lake. We're having a really hard time. And we're trying to get this bolt off, and it's rusted on. We're trying and trying. And finally my brother goes, that bolt is tighter than the bark on a tree. Oh, we laughed our heads off. Well, I look up, and my nephew is staring right at us. And I think, perfect. That phrase will live another generation. I was saying my dad grew up on a farm, and I loved visiting his farms. We would go to that farm, and we would have what was called unstructured time, which now they call boredom. But I was never bored on that farm. I loved it. I loved it. And I've never been bored since. I've been to some plays where I wished I was somewhere else, and other plays where I would have fallen asleep if I hadn't been the one talking. But I still have never been bored, and I've got my grandparents to thank. My grandpa was as wide as he was tall. We used to say, if it wasn't for the direction of his buttons, we wouldn't have known if he was laying down or standing up. And my grandmother, Teutonic farmer, everything in its right place, everything in its right order. I remember there was a rooster on that farm, and it would always peck me. And I go, Grandma, that rooster's pecking me. She'd say, just leave it alone. Well, one day, that rooster pecked my sister, and that night we ate chicken. Toughest chicken I ever ate. But from my grandmother I learned, be careful who you peck. So I love going to this farm. Farming, the Greeks call it an oneric space. And an oneric space is a place where dream and reality can come together as one. And I always think of that farm as my oneric space. And I have a buddy named Dave, and he lives down in Worthington. And Dave is a farmer. And he used to say when he was a kid, whereas most kids held a blanket or a teddy bear to get to sleep, he couldn't fall asleep unless he was clutching an ear of corn. And Dave said, at the state fair, his family's on that plaque of 100-year-old farms. And Dave's family is on that plaque, but he came across hard times like so many farmers do. And he had to start selling off his farm a little bit at a time. He ended up getting a job in town so that he could stay out there on that farm. And now he just has a few acres left. And so he started calling his farm his art. And he's painted tractor on his tractor, and he painted barn on his barn. And one year he plowed up all of his land and he planted sunflowers. And his neighbors are going, what are you doing, Dave? Why would you plant sunflowers? There's no money in that. And he said, because I can't paint like Van Gogh. And then I said, Dave, what do you do? I mean, why do you grow sunflowers? What do you like about them? And he goes, my favorite thing? He says, I love standing in the field with the sunflowers. As the sun goes by, their heads follow the sun across the sky. And I said, well, what do they do, Dave, when it's cloudy? what do they do when there's no sun? And he said, that's even better. That's when they turn and face each other. So I was thinking about gathering, the way we do gather. I remember in college, I was in theater too, and my dad would send me these letters. They weren't letters, they were newspaper clippings with actors starves to death in New York, and 2% of the actors union employed, and Bob Crane, star of Hogan's Heroes, found stabbed to death in driveway. And I would get these in the mail, and it was my dad's way of saying, don't go into the arts. I don't want my son in the arts. And so when I got out, I thought, I'm going to get a job. I'm going to get a job in a theater. And I did. I got a job at the Guthrie Theater. It wasn't on stage. I was dumping out garbage and working backstage. But I got to see these amazing directors work. Liviu Ciulei from Romania, just amazing. He had this thick Romanian accent. And I remember there was an actor on stage one time, and he did this monologue, Shakespearean monologue. And when he got done, Ciulei said, no, more eccentric. So the actor did the monologue again. This time he put a little tick on his face. And Ciulei, no, more eccentric. So now the actor starts writhing. And Ciulei, no, more eccentric. So now the actor's frothing at the mouth, wiggling on the floor. And Ciulei turns to the dramaturg, who is also from Romania, and he whispers something, and the dramaturg nods and tells the actor, he wants you to stand more in the center. So I wanted to prove to my dad that I was meant for the arts. I was meant for theater. So I did get a job. I got a job at the Paul Bunyan Playhouse in Bemidji, Minnesota. And we had the most amazing time. We would do a show a week for a whole summer. So like 10 shows in a row, boom, 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 one right after the other. It was the most incredibly intense, wonderful time. And so I was performing up there, and there was a ghost. And we all heard about this ghost. Most people saw it. I think I saw him one time. And in fact, the mayor of the town, Ned, said he'd seen the ghost. And we were on a radio program one time, and I thought, oh, God, I'm going to get Ned here. So I go, hey, Ned, have you seen that ghost? And he says, oh, yeah, of course I've seen the ghost. And then after the radio program, I felt so bad. I thought, geez, I said, Ned, I'm so sorry. I know in front of all your constituents, I busted you on seeing this ghost. And he goes, no, more people have seen it than not. You probably got me votes. And so everybody had seen this ghost, and the theater's going, let's do something. Let's figure this out, what this ghost is all about. So they got this ghost talker who would talk to ghosts on the other side. And they got this ghost talker. His name was Gary. And Gary didn't talk directly to the ghost. Gary had somebody on the other side named Betty. And he would talk to Betty, who would talk to the ghost. And so Betty and Gary got in an argument that night, and she wouldn't talk to him. And so he goes, well, who will you talk to? And she said, Kevin. So he went and knocked on my door, and he goes, come on. He said, I need you, because Betty will talk to you. So I sat there. I didn't even hear her talking to me, but Gary could hear her talking to me, and Gary stared at me and wrote on this yellow sheet of paper. And his hand went up and down, and it never stopped. And then when he was done, he crossed T's and dotted I's, and he had this story. And it was about, of all things, it was about a guy named Dave. He said, my name is Dave. I was walking home from Bemidji out of town. I got to Rutgers Lodge where the theater was, and he said, I was hit by a car. He said, maybe a drunk driver, I think, but I'm not sure. And he said, and my spirit flew into the nearest thing, which was the theater. And Gary said, yeah, that's what their spirits do. They will fly into the nearest thing, whether it's a tree or a building. And Dave said he flew into this building, and he said this is when his life really began. Because all of a sudden, here's these people. All of a sudden, here's kings and queens. And he said, and even ordinary people, he said, sometimes their lives would be so rich that they would just burst into song. He said, I didn't know life was this good. And Gary turns to me and he goes, I don't think he knows he's dead. And I said, I don't think he does either. And Gary said, should we tell him? I go, no, don't tell him. So Dave kept talking, and he said, I know I'm supposed to be somewhere else, but I'm not ready to go yet. This is so rich. And Gary said, I can move him along if you want me to. And everyone in the theater said, no, we want to keep Dave here. And so Gary said, all right, and we did. And there were still many sightings after that. Nothing bad ever happened. And Dave even said, I won't hurt anybody. I just want to stay. and I want to be with these people. And I started to think when we do go to the theater or we do go hear a storyteller or music, and we're all in the same room together, but we're not in the same place. We weren't even tonight. We're all in different places when we enter somewhere, but then the lights come down, and then as they come back up, there we are, and we're transported to this other place. I mean, we're like the performers in the audience, like two wings on this belief, holding it aloft. And I mean, some people get a much needed laugh. Some people get a much needed cry. Some people at least know that they're not alone. And I realize that we love and hate and desire as much as any king or queen or hero that ever lived. The story, the play, the music just reminds us of that. When we gather, when we do get together, it's not that we agree, it's a bargain that we come together where we belong. I bring who I am to who you are, our herd, our flock, our pack, a constellation. Each person like a star bringing a bit of light to the darkness. Each voice another instrument in the silence. And this brings me to my final poem. This poem comes from the fact that this earth doesn't have the minerals that it takes to create life. Like iron. Iron had to come from a comet or an asteroid or a planet that crashed into this planet that gave us iron for our blood. And so if that's true, this room right here, everybody's a piece of a star. And this room is a constellation, unique and to this very moment. And these are some things that I've learned in my time among constellations. I've learned there are families that I share my blood and families I would give my blood. I've learned that knowledge is acquired, but wisdom is recognized. I've learned that love thrives in audacity, it dies in carelessness, and hides in simple gestures. I've learned there's the trip you plan, and then the trip you take. And home has gone from a place that is to one I remember to one I now create, where I know the names of the gods, what's funny, what's edible, what's sacred, and now where I will find you. So I'm looking up to the stars, and I know now, though not burning any longer, some still send their light. So I'm looking to the past and the future. I'm looking to home. And somewhere between where I stand and they send their light, we meet. Me looking to the heavens and the stars looking down at what it's like to be alive. Thanks.
Kevin Kling. Please welcome again Galen Lee.
Let's give one more round of applause for all the storytellers. That was beautiful. Really, really cool. I had to try not to cry right before I came up, So, anyways, here we go. So this, I'm going to do 2 more tunes for you tonight. This is a traditional Irish tune called South Wind, and it's a waltz, and I just love waltzes. So here we go. Thank you. So, the last song I'm gonna do is kind of apocalyptic. I just like ending the show that way. There's no real deeper meaning other than where else do you put the apocalypse but at the end. So this is a Finnish traditional tune called Matuszak, and it means forest flowers, but the arrangement is quite a bit darker than the original that you would hear at like a Finnish traditional concert. So this is Matuszak, and thank you so much to PBS for having us here, for WDSE, and to Kevin and all the storytellers. This was just a beautiful evening, so thank you for having me.